G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our first Australia's Biggest Book Club episode of 2024 and to the opening webinar for our webinar series this year. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm super excited about today's webinar. But before we kick off, in 2024, the Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary. That's 30 years of big ideas and changing public policy for the better. And to celebrate, we're going to be hosting some special events this year, some special guests for speaking to us. And over the course of the year, we'll be taking a look back at some of the Australia Institute's history of research and how influential it has been on public policy and the national public policy debate. And if you've seen anything today about reports about changing the stage 3 tax cuts from the government, that is the Australia Institute's research at its best and being influential today. We've been working on that issue since the stage 3 tax cuts were set up in 2018. So the culmination of a lot of work, and you can head on over to our website to find out more information about that. I do want to begin today by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Australia's Biggest Book Club is held once a month. It's a new series for us, but we're pretty excited about it. Days and times for the webinars do vary, so please head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find out more information about our upcoming book club events, webinar events, and in-person events like Politics in the Pub. Our next episode of Australia's Biggest Book Club is in February, and that will be featuring sexual consent activist and her book Consent Laid Bare. Just a few tips about Zoom before we begin. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to find a Q&A box where you can type in questions for David. And you should also be able to make comments in the chat. You should also be able to upvote other people's questions. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on our website later today. And at some point, we're going to turn it into a podcast as well. So our guest today, David Marr, hardly needs an introduction, but he is the recipient of 4 Walkley Awards for journalism. His book include Patrick White, A Life, The High Price of Heaven, Dark Victory, which he wrote with Marion Wilkinson, and 6 best-selling quarterly essays. He's written for the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, the Saturday paper The Guardian and The Monthly, and served as editor of the National Times and a reporter for Four Corners. And of course, those of you who remember as presenter of ABC TV's Media Watch. This book is his new one. It is Killing for Country. It's absolutely fantastic. It's an incredible read. And in this new book, David, I want to welcome you to this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us for Australia's Biggest Book Club.
Ebony, thank you very much for having me here.
So this all kicked off, this book, because you went looking for some information about some of your ancestors and found something you weren't expecting. Can we start there with how this book kind of got kicked off?
Well, the rule seems to be that we get more curious about our families as we get older. And an uncle of mine, my mother's brother, as he approached his 90s, sort of realized that he knew nothing about his grandmother. And he asked me, because I'm a journalist, if I would dig around and find out something about Maud Ewer, his grandmother, which I did. And within about half an hour of starting work, I had come across a picture of her father in the uniform of the Queensland Native Police. And that was a heart-sinking moment, let me tell you. I quickly went to Wikipedia in the hope that I had misunderstood the nature of the Queensland Native Police, but no, I was spot on. I knew exactly who they were. White officers, black troopers, designed to enforce dispersals and killings on the frontier. And within about, an hour or so, out of a mix of embarrassment, shame, and curiosity, I decided I was going to have to write about this. And that's what I did for the next 4.5 years.
Yeah, I'm not surprised it took you 4.5 years. The amount of detail in here and history is just exceptional. So congratulations on what must have been just an absolute kind of enormous effort in the archives, let alone anything else. But I was really curious because you did kick off or start the book. But, the reason for it was, I believe, a photo of Reginald, as you mentioned, that you discovered.
Yeah.
But we actually, you start the book, you start the book with the merchant, Richard Jones, and someone who goes back kind of even further in your family history. So why did you kind of start the book even further back in the past from where you kind of entered it, I guess?
Well, first on research, my co-worker in all of this was my partner, Sebastian Tesoriero. They're my words, but a great deal of the research is his. And he is a former lawyer, and he has a passion for accuracy that is spectacular. And also, I had wonderful professional researchers working for us in the archives in Sydney and in Brisbane. But what happened as the research deepened was that the nature of the book changed, the book that I had in my mind. I had thought that I would write a book about the squalid adventures of Reginald Ewer and his brother Darcy, who was also an officer in the Queensland Native Police, and follow their time in the force, which was in the middle of the 1860s, very soon after Queensland broke away from New South Wales, and at the most brutal, in the most brutal years on the Queensland frontier. But what I found was that the family story, if I went back a couple of steps, would actually explain the commercial pressures, the political foundations, and the practical reasons why slaughter was let loose through the Australian bush. Because these Ewer boys, their father, so we go back, their father, they were brought out from the Thameside slums when a rich Sydney merchant and would-be squatter married their sister. Why this 36-year-old merchant married a beautiful 19-year-old girl from the slums in London, it's never been completely clear, but he did. And then he looked after the whole family, and he brought this tribe out to Australia to work on his whaling boats and to work on his property. And so this man, who so little has been written about, yet he was a member of the Legislative Council of New South Wales for roughly 15 years. He was the president of the Bank of New South Wales for about the same period. He was immensely rich, and in his lifetime, he seized or was granted or bought or chiseled over 600,000 acres of land for the sheep that he brought out from Britain. So he allowed me to tell a much wider, deeper story that fascinated me because it got into the commerce, the politics, and the brutality of what was going on in the colony of New South Wales. And I tell you, Ebony, I came away with the conclusion that just about everybody in that colony was a crook of some kind or other, a crook, a chiseler, a fraud, a deceiver. And it turned into, for those who remember it, an immense National Times story, the paper I once edited, because this was all about the intersection of crime and government that eventually leads to the hideous careers on the frontier of the Ewer brothers.
Well, I was shocked, I must admit, obviously by the violence of the book, but just how much you can pretty much draw a straight line from the politics of then to the politics of now. That wasn't necessarily what I was expecting when you started to go into that history. Did that come through really clearly for you as you were kind of uncovering that?
I was writing the last stages of the book during the referendum campaign. And I was hearing and watching on television the same arguments against the Aboriginal people that were used in the 1830s, you know, that were used at the very beginning of dispossession. They were being still used, still serviceable in Australia all those years later. And in particular, two in particular, the big one that those people who spoke up for Aborigines, they were called the friends of the blacks in those days, were city folk, generally prosperous, ignorant of the ways of the bush, and anxious to show off what great humanitarians they were. That's in the 1830s. And the same arguments in 2022, 2023. The other big argument, of course, is that all money spent on Aboriginal people is wasted. And in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, that was the argument used for giving the Aboriginal people no share whatever of the immense wealth that was being made on their lands. Nothing for education, nothing for support, nothing for housing, nothing, because it would simply be wasted. And then, you know, what is it, 200 years later, there we are, nearly 200 years later, listening to people saying, oh, all this money has been spent on Aborigines and every penny of it has been wasted, squandered, useless. The same voices, the same argument, and alas, the same results.
And I was really fascinated to kind of read about, you know, the charitableness of the time. It was hard times. There wasn't a lot around in the colonies. You know, at the beginning, a lot of people in need, a lot of people that you write about were very charitable. But that, as you said, just didn't extend to the Aboriginal people. That was one element that I was really struck by right at the beginning of the book. But I did kind of want to get into the dispossession and, as you said, securing all that land and the role that commerce and the sheep trade, the wool trade, and the expansion of the colony had in the violence that you wrote about in that first part of the book.
Well, until 1835, there had been a rule that there would be settlement in Van Diemen's Land, and God, I wish they never changed that name. Isn't Van Diemen's Land wonderful? And there'd be a little settlement around Port Phillip, and then there would be a settlement around Sydney. And there was a line drawn around Sydney that went sort of from the top of the Hunter Valley out west of Bathurst and then down to the south coast, down around below Eden on the south coast. These were the 19 counties. Everything was to stay within that county. Then the Whigs got control in Britain. After many, many, many years in opposition, the Tories were beaten, the Whigs got control. And in Britain, the Whigs did wonderful things, wonderful things. The Great Reform Bill, the Catholics were brought back into the political arena in Britain, and of course, slavery. You know, it was clumsy and it was expensive, but they ended slavery without warfare. And great things were hoped for in Australia, but there was another Whig thing, and that is that God mandated that the wilderness be made profitable. And so the line around Sydney was abandoned, and squatters were allowed to flood out in the great wool boom of the 1830s. And there were no restrictions whatever placed on them. No land was reserved for its Indigenous owners. There was essentially no law and order out there. There was no punishment for squatters who killed Aborigines, which began at once. I mean, the slaughters began at once. There was no punishment. There was no policing. It was open slather. And that open slather essentially continued on the east coast of Australia for the rest of the century. And there were one or two attempts to rein things in. And the most famous of them was the Mile Creek Massacre which was a massacre of absolutely peaceful Aboriginal people to the north of the Liverpool Plains in New South Wales. And a wonderful Attorney General actually prosecuted the shepherds, but not the squatter leader of the killings. But that was it. That was it. And not only killing, but even though there were laws against it, there were no prosecutions of the kidnappers either. We tend to forget that the dispossession involved more than simply throwing Aboriginal people off their land and the killings that occurred during that. There was also, for right through the century, kidnappings of women for sex, kidnapping of children for work, and almost inevitably, it must have been for sex as well. Never prosecuted. I became, Ebony, really interested in the gap between the laws on the books and the laws enforced. And that's a gap that continues today. That's still an interesting gap today. But the story of the frontier is the story of the laws that were never enforced, just never enforced. It was not as though there had to be great legislation or you know, a revolutionary rethink about the rule of law. These laws were continued for decade after decade because no one enforced the law.
That was one of the key things that stuck out to me in terms of the straight line between the politics of then and now that I was thinking of, because even today we know just how disproportionate and selectively the law has been applied and how terrible our justice system has been for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And as you said, it just goes straight back to the very beginning of this colony. I did just want to mention we've got the book and a special discount code for people in the chat if you haven't yet bought a copy of the book. It's really fantastic. And that idea, I think one of the quotes in here was restraint where possible, brutal punishment if necessary. I want to come back to the kidnappings a little bit later when we talk about Darcy.
Yeah.
But this is maybe one of the bloodiest books I have read since Game of Thrones. The violence in it is just intense and continual. And that idea that the laws were on the books but never prosecuted is one thing I thought was so important. But the other side of that is even back then, there were people who were raising these issues, who were appalled at the violence, who did seek justice for Aboriginal people, whether for the killings or for the kidnappings. It wasn't a case that this was all going just unchallenged. And I feel like that's maybe something that we think about that's not true right now. Would you say that's the case?
I don't think I could have written this book without those voices, without the people who all along were saying, this is theft of the land, this is murder of the deaths of Aboriginal people, this is inhumane, indeed unchristian, to see communities reduced to squalor. It is the great answer to those who look back on this time in Australia and say, people were different then. People don't change. The good and the bad, the greed and mercy, that all of those are continuous aspects of human beings. It's why we can understand ancient literature, because, you know, what Sophocles was writing about and Shakespeare was writing about are us, you know, still today. And the book is dedicated to those who told the truth from the start. And they were an interesting bunch of people. They were very few churchmen, certainly not from the Church of England's record, particularly under the much honoured Bishop Broughton, was appalling, deeply, profoundly embarrassing. They propped up the government. There were squatters who knew that it was possible to share their land with its Aboriginal owners, and did so. It took work, it took negotiation, it took care, it meant sharing, but you could do it. And they were strong voices, particularly against the depredations of the native police later on, saying, you come here and you just make everything worse by your killings. So good squatters, some very good missionaries, particularly Congregationalist missionaries, dissenting church missionaries. There were some good lawyers, but I must say that the people who come out of it best were the writers, the politicians, the journalists, the editors, and a few owners of newspapers who not only were absolutely clear about their values and clear about what was going on, but opened their papers to eloquent, beautiful, tough debates about the nature of colonization as it was happening. And they are very strong in the book. They are very strong because they explain that it was always possible for this to be done differently. Colonization was inevitable. There's no point fantasizing about Australia remaining an indigenous continent. That could not happen. But Australia was uniquely appalling about the way in which it was colonized. And yes, it leads to a book which is filled with violence.
We'll come to the native police in just a second, but I did the Kilcoy poisoning and the nature of that compared to kind of confrontations I'm thinking of with guns and things like that. Can you tell people a little bit about that poisoning?
After the trials and hanging of shepherds involved in the Mile Creek massacre, which was a shootout, there was a feeling that you could kill more efficiently and with less fuss with poisoning. Now, there's a lot of poison around on the frontier because arsenic was used to treat scab in sheep. So every shepherd's hut had arsenic in it. There were, therefore, poisonings. And the worst of these, still a moment of shame in the history of this country, was poisoning on an immense run called Kilcoy in the hinterland of Brisbane, up in the hills behind Brisbane. It's important to understand that area was taken up, as we say, seized, in other words, by a group of very rich Scots, and some of them are still there. The good ones are still there, but Kilcoy was taken up by the Mackenzie family. It was named after their castle in Scotland. They were having trouble with the blacks who were spearing their sheep, and a shepherd was killed. Many shepherds, by the way, died on the frontier, many shepherds. And so they decided that they would give the local Aboriginal people, who were always asking for food, they would give them a mash laced with arsenic. And somewhere between 50 and 60 people died. Now, that set off a war in that area because the tribes, the peoples came together to fight the squatters, and indeed very successfully for a time. But what in a way matters most about the Kilcoy poisoning is that it was never investigated. It was never investigated at all. The missionaries were asked, how they knew about it. But the Mackenzies were never interrogated. Indeed, during the scandal, one of those Mackenzies was made a magistrate, a gentleman magistrate up there, but they were never investigated. And it seems that the reason was that the Mackenzie family of Kilcoy in Scotland outranked the government, and therefore they couldn't be exposed to inquiry. And those killings went unpunished.
And I also raised that because throughout the book, there's kind of violence and reprisals constantly.
I
And
hope there are other things as well. I hope
no, there's lots in there. But it is, it is a theme. Well, not a theme.
That is the
It is
pattern of the frontier.
exactly what happened. And you talk about the murder of John Ewer and what happened in response to that. So with the Kilcoy poisoning, it was kind of a mass killing of people all in one spot. But after the murder of John Ewer, it was kind of a lot of killings and murders of Aboriginal people, all of whom were presumed to be responsible for that one murder, basically used as an excuse for the violence.
Yes, it was used as an excuse for Black deaths inside Brisbane and in the country around Brisbane. It's important to remember that this family, of which I'm a descendant and which I'm writing about, did have this experience at its heart, that one of the boys was actually killed by the Blacks. He was a troubled young man. He'd been in an asylum for a while. He went back to Europe for a while. He came back out. And he was working in a very lowly job as a shepherd on the outskirts of one of the family's properties, where the Wivenhoe Dam is now, in the hinterland of Brisbane. The place was called, part of it was called Wivenhoe. And this was the first death of, quote, a gentleman. He wasn't really, but they all pretended to be, in the killings in that area. And there were rewards offered for rounding up the killers, and those rewards led to a number of reprisal attacks of Aboriginal people who there was never any proof that they had any connection whatever to the killing of Mr. Ewer, but it was, as you say, used as an excuse for a few years for any random killing. The dead man was said to have been a participant in the murder of Mr. Ewer. It was handy.
So tell us next about the Native police and your ancestors, Darcy and Reg.
The native police were modelled on forces all through the British Empire, and in fact, in empires going back before Rome, where the conquerors used the locals to further the conquest. And so there were outfits in South Africa, white officers and local men. In India, they were called the sepoys. They operated in North America under British rule. They were to operate in New Zealand as well. So a standard imperial device. And they began in Australia because South African merchant had brought the idea with him of Mile Creek. The government decided that a much bigger force would be established for what was then northern New South Wales. So that was for Queensland and the north of what's still New South Wales. And about 100 men were recruited, mainly from around the Murrumbidgee, and then taken hundreds of miles, because that was crucial. You had to take the Aboriginal recruits out of their own country, and they were taken up to the Darling Downs to begin their work. And for those recruits, young men whose way of life had been completely broken, victims who, as one of my Indigenous sources told me, reminded me, victims don't make good choices. And they enlisted, were taken north, and they began a regime of killing in the rivers around the Darling Downs, and then they moved further north. a job as an officer of the native police was highly prized. You got a couple of £100 a year when you got some seniority. Those jobs were not reserved for superb bushmen, though one of the Ewer brothers was a great bushman. They were reserved for the contacts of politicians. You got your job in the native police by having contacts. The Ewer family had those contacts, and they were able to secure 2 positions in the force. These men, the officers, lived with their men, patrolled with their men, and directed the men in their killing expeditions. And the native police survived in Queensland, and there were versions of the native police in South Australia and a rather different arrangement, but equally brutal in Western Australia. But the native police survived in Queensland roughly until the First World War. As the frontier was conquered in Queensland, the numbers diminished, but there was still, in fact, one station of native police operating on the Cape York goldfields into the 1920s. But essentially, its great time was from 1848 to the end of the century, and they killed on a huge scale.
Yeah, I think one of the quotes here from one of the supervisors of Darcy was, the only thing to do with badly behaved blacks was to kill them. That did seem to be kind of how they resolved, as you said, the dispersals, that lovely euphemism. But Darcy, as you mentioned earlier, was also involved in a lot of kidnappings of young Aboriginal boys from Swiss Island and elsewhere on the Gulf. So it wasn't just killings that they were involved with there.
Let me say something about the 2 brothers. Reg was an orderly, dependable officer of the native police. He was discreet, as they were asked to be. He's very bad at keeping his accounts and doing the paperwork, but he was a dependable officer leading massacres. And some of those massacres are amongst the best accounts we have of frontier massacres in Australia that were conducted by Reg. His brother Darcy was bad from the start. I'm not saying that Reg's career was good, but Darcy was a wild kid, and when he went into the force, he was a wild man in the force. He hated supervision of any kind. He was the first policeman to go into the Gulf. He went up into the Gulf in the 1860s with the first kind of attempts at providing order up there for what was an insane Wild West community up there. And that was where Darcy went in. And kidnappings were very often done as favors. You knew somebody who needed a boy for the stockyards. You need somebody who needed a girl for the kitchens. And so after you'd killed their parents, you'd round up the children and distribute them in towns and settlements. And that was considered, a decent thing to do. There was an argument put forward by the church that you were offering these children the possibilities of salvation. Do you like that? Offering the possibility of salvation because they'd be taken into a Christian household. What was done to them there was, essentially slavery. Darcy was notorious for this, and he so horrified some people up in the Gulf that they actually got together and wrote to the Queensland Attorney General and said, "We are willing to give evidence against this man. Please prosecute him." And there are 3 or 4 witnesses willing to come forward to make sure that the prosecution succeeds. And the Queensland government didn't prosecute. And the failure to prosecute Darcy Ewer was the template for the complete failure for the rest of the century to prosecute any kidnappers on the frontier.
I'm going to come to questions from the audience in just a second. I can see we've got 1,200 people live on the line with us, and we had more than 2,200 register for today's webinar. So thank you all for joining us. Before we go to questions from the audience, I did kind of want to finish our conversation with how your extended family has received this book and kind of place it back in this present moment. As you said, you were finishing up writing it during the Voice campaign. It still seems incredibly relevant. And I have to say, I was ashamed at how little I knew reading this, and obviously how much information there is available.
But Ebony,
if you go looking for it.
I thought I knew this subject back to front. I'd read all the Henry Reynolds books. I'd read other books as well. I'm a huge admirer of Henry Reynolds. But when it came down to digging into particular lives and the particular track a family cut through the forests of the frontier, I discovered so much more that made sense of the decision to maintain this brutal regime. And the native police were not something that were idly maintained. They had to be funded. They had to be defended from their critics. They had to be defended from those who said they were too expensive. They had to be defended from the squatters who said they just make things worse. This was a squad of state-sanctioned killers that required political and economic organization to maintain. And so for me, there were these just discoveries after discoveries along this way. But I interrupted you before you were going to ask a question.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask about how your family received this once you started digging into the history.
Well, first of all, every time I appear anywhere, I say this has nothing to do with the Marrs. The Marrs were absolutely splendid Scots a Scottish blacksmith who came to Sydney and did okay for himself. The Marrs are blameless, wonderful people. Please don't think for a moment, except for the little bit of Marrs who married into my mother's family, who are the villains here. Look, my siblings and nephews and nieces have grown up. They were a bit worried at first. I've done as much as I possibly can to embarrass them throughout my career. And this was going to be another big embarrassment. They all backed me at the end. They all understood what it was about. As one of my sisters said to me, no, this story has to be told, but I still wish it didn't involve our family. More distantly, there's been a good deal of division about the book. And I have a cousin, John Ewer, who is a distinguished academic at the ANU, and he thinks the book's wonderful. But other members of the Ewer family are very distressed. And there are people scattered from, Perth to remote New Zealand who are cousins, and some wish that it had not been written, some are applauding that it had been written. And that seems to me to be pretty much the verdict of the family, and the verdict of the country is pretty much the same.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience now. The first one is from David Stevens, who asks, do you think the dead of the frontier wars should be commemorated at the Australian War Memorial and other war memorials?
Now, my partner, Sebastian Tesoriero, is the kind of person who reads legislation. And he went to the legislation that sets up the aims and the methods of the Australian War Memorial, and found that the native police absolutely conform to the definition of an imperial force before federation, which must be commemorated at the Australian War Memorial. Now, how they are commemorated is up to the War Memorial, but I don't expect that their heroic efforts would be celebrated in any of those sad halls. My suggestion is that we put up a statue in bronze of an officer and a trooper, and put under it words to the effect, we don't know how many you killed. By the way, historians are now talking about north of 40,000 dead at the hands of the native police. We don't know how many you killed, but we will not forget them, and let us commemorate them.
Yeah, truly shocking numbers. The next question is from Kath Atma Pananki Travis, who asks, as a First Nations historian, I'm wondering what the impact of your book has had on First Nations people, if any, particularly those that have had difficulties trying to fill in gaps in their own stories about where their ancestors come from.
The response has been quite divided. There are, I mean, the book is very beautifully commended by Marcia Langton on its cover, and other Aboriginal Indigenous leaders have been absolutely terrific about the book. There are those, however, who would actually prefer that this history not be brought, that we not chew over this history, and let's forget it and move on. And in that respect, the Indigenous and non-Indigenous response to the book has been very similar amongst some. And there are those who are deeply troubled by the fact that these killings were essentially carried out by Indigenous people. And I have done all I could to explain that this is an imperial, as I said earlier, that this is an imperial device that goes back in history to before Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain, that these were terrible times for young men when they were offered a spot in the native police. But they were principally recruits. We do know that there were people dragooned into, kidnapped into the native police, and in Queensland, Indigenous prisoners in jails could serve out their time in the ranks of the native police. But the native police are as troubling for the Indigenous as they are for the whites. And this book is, I suppose, inevitably about ventilating those troubles and bringing sunlight to them, and that involves a lot of pain.
The next question is from Anthony Abrams, who says he's 2/3 of the way through your book. So he apologizes if you've addressed this in the final third. But his question is around you and your other researchers. How did you use the massacre research of the team under Professor Lyndall Ryan at the Uni of Newcastle and other researchers in your work? If you could just tell us a little bit more about whose other work you drew on for this.
And I never picked you as a slow reader, but obviously I've misjudged you all your life. Look, at the back of the book, there are something like 30 pages of sources, and Lyndall Ryan and the massacre map, which was also worked on by Lorena Allam of the Guardian, my colleague on the Guardian, the Indigenous correspondent there, was fantastically useful. Really fantastically useful. There is so much material still being gathered, but being gathered all the time about the massacres and about just the flow of events on the frontier. But also, of course, the great device we have now, which historians didn't have of an earlier generation, is Trove, where the National Library, great search engine Trove, allows us to word search newspapers, back to the 1790s. Alas, it doesn't work for absolutely modern times, but it's wonderful. And the other great source for me, or for us in the team researching the book, were local historians. Local historians know so much in such fine detail about their towns and regions. And in particular, I commend the local historians in Maryborough, who call themselves, by the way, the Maryboroughers. They're splendid. They absolutely set me on the right path there. I was steaming down the wrong stretch of the river, and they rescued me. So local historians the great professional historians like Lyndall Ryan, Henry Reynolds. I'm looking along the books I've got here, old and new. That's what we used.
Mm. The next question is from Barbara Preston, who says her own ancestors include wealthy wool growers from central western New South Wales from the 1870s. And she's interested in the alliance between wealthy wool industry interests and the church and their opposition to non-sectarian public schooling and the King's School, which you kind of talk about at the beginning of the book, and where some of the brothers were educated.
I didn't go to the King's School. I think I need to confess that. And so, the wretched history of the King's School always thrills me a bit. And it was great to discover that Richard Jones, the family patron, was part of the operation that destroyed plans. They were Whig government plans, orders, plans that a system of secular education be set up for all the children of the colony. And Jones, Bishop Broughton, and other squatters brought that undone, principally because it would mean Catholic and Protestant children mingling in the same playground. But the rage of anti-Catholicism at that time is a very important part of our history. Indeed, it's an important part of our history until about the 1960s, but at that time it was venomous. And when such a large proportion of the convicts were Catholic, the white guys, the Protestants, the rich, could not cope with the notion of those Catholic children being properly educated. And the money that was supposed to have been spent to educate all the children of the colony was essentially spent setting up the King's School.
Quite something. Not much has changed in that respect.
Oh, and I must say also that Reg Ewer went to King's. So, and I'm puzzled that King's doesn't in any way celebrate Reg Ewer's career in the native police. And I think I might have to send a copy of the book to the school so that they can take a look.
I also enjoyed the headmaster who came out with grand ambitions for what the school could achieve and kind of like a pipeline to greater education in the UK or in England. And you mentioned that the parents of children who went there had much lower ambitions for their
They didn't want that. No, they didn't want that. That's highfalutin stuff. But you could pay a little extra and learn ballroom dancing. So, it was not without some kind of commitment to higher virtues.
I've got a couple of people in here kind of commenting on any pushback that the book might have received. So mentions of the Keith Windshuttle types. How is the book going in terms of its reception on that front in the culture wars?
I've not heard a whisper. Not a whisper. I don't know what that means. I mean, but so far not a whisper. I've been blessed with extraordinarily strong positive reviews, and there's not yet been a whisper, but we will see. We will see. I've had some wonderful correspondence with people who have pointed out little details that I've got wrong in the book. You couldn't drive stock overland from the Kimberley to the West Australian goldfields until the Canning stock route was opened in 1910, David. They came by ship. And I absolutely love that. I love that. I want the text to be accurate down to its tiniest details. But there's been no fight back on the bigger front from those who have, at least in the past, claimed that the settlement of Australia was essentially peaceful.
Jack Bowers, this is kind of more of a comment, I guess, says beyond the killings. Oh, no, here it is, the question. What underpins this book is the circulation of power between squatters, businessmen and politicians. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit for us? Because, as you said, that's part of the reason why you went back earlier in your family's history.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that interaction of power and how that played out?
I came across this fascinating argument in the course of writing the book that I think underlies the whole power dynamic of the frontier, and explains the extraordinary cowardice of the imperial government faced with the irrefutable evidence of slaughter in Australia. And that's this, that the American War of Independence had nothing whatever to do with taxes on tea. And certainly the fact that there was no parliamentary representation irked the settlers in North America. The real problem was that the British government had drawn a line down the Appalachians and said the land to the west of that line essentially remains in Indian hands. And if those colonies were to expand west, go west, young man, go west. If they were to expand west, they had to get rid of the line, and the line meant getting rid of Britain. And the War of Independence in the United States of America, in this new argument that is being scholars are putting forward, the War of American Independence was essentially a war of colonial expansion. You had to get rid of Britain in order to colonize the West, which meant that 30 or 40 years later, when lines were being drawn in Australia, and I mentioned the line around Sydney, around the 19 colonies, there was no reservation on the other side of that line for its Indigenous owners. No one was saying, but to the west of that line, that's all black lands. There were to be no reservations because they were just too troublesome, and they'd lost Britain, the North American colonies. And I think that underlines the cowardice, the lack of investment in maintaining order in the new colony of Australia, while at the same time, these gorgeous floods of rhetoric are coming down about the exquisite care for the native peoples that is expected of colonial officials by the king and then by the queen. There were dispatches and orders from the very highest levels of Britain, which were just simply ignored. That's, I think, what really underlies the power dynamic.
There's a couple of questions in here too from Michael Waterhouse and others who ask about, in the wake of the Voice referendum result, what can individuals do to be engaged in truth-telling in relation to their own local communities or ancestors?
There's been an argument for 40 or 50 years now that the problem was that we forgot the true history of Australia. I think that's too easy. What happened in Australia was the creation, an amazing creation of a fake history for the country, a fake history that we could be proud of. And that fake history goes something like Cook, convicts, sheep, gold, Eureka Stockade, Gallipoli. And it's fake. And I think the thing that we most need to do in Australia at the moment is to understand that we've been fooled by the history, by the official history of this country. And it's happening everywhere. We're just dismantling this fake, warm official history of the country. And that's going on very, very fully. But the other thing, Ebony, I think we need to keep an eye on is what's happening in New Zealand at the moment, where New Zealand is held up as an example to us because of the decision in the 1970s to actually respect and enforce the Treaty of Waitangi, And now politics in New Zealand is talking about dismantling the treaty apparatus of Waitangi. And we do need to be reminded that great reforms, great changes for the better can be dismantled. We haven't got there yet, but we look across the ditch at New Zealand and they're walking backwards. And this is an alarming thing. We have to learn about the history of the country and understand the contemporary politics.
Mm. And I think we saw the same in the wake of the Voice result, that even that modest request kind of being knocked back has emboldened a range of people to kind of question acknowledgement of country and the push for land rights and the push for a treaty as well all over the country.
But more profoundly than that, Ebony, I think you saw in Australia what's operating now in New Zealand, which is this argument of equality. That there should be no special agencies, no special departments, no special dealing with the Indigenous. We should all have the same thing, and that's actually being. I think Tony Abbott is one of the people who is saying that we're all equal here in this country, and that would mean abolishing the Aboriginal legal service, abolishing the Aboriginal medical service, abolishing specialist services to the settlements and that kind of thing. And there is a strong but minority push for that kind of thing in both countries.
Mm. We're going to have to wrap it up very soon, David, but is there any last thoughts that you'd like to leave anyone with as a result of having read this book and the kind of personal journey that you went on as you discovered all of this stuff about your family?
This book is in part an act of atonement. It's in part an act of rage. I hope it's a good-tempered book. I hope it's possible that I've found a way of leading readers through a grim history by staying calm, by being clear, and moving along at a reasonable pace. I know that many readers find it really hard, and I respect that, but I would hope that you read to the end because I think that this can be a window into the reality of this country. I didn't know it was there. And I hope I found it for other people as well.
Well, you certainly did for me. It's been an incredible read. I've found out so much from reading this book. And as I said, personally, I just found such clear lines between things I can see happening in politics now and things that were happening in the very earliest days of the colony. And it was an absolutely gripping read. So congratulations on turning what I'm sure was a massive amount of research into this incredible book. I'm so glad that it's being well received. And if anyone who's joined us today for Australia's Biggest Book Club hasn't yet picked up their copy, please do. It's in all good bookshops. We've got a special that you can find online, a special discount for Biggest Book Club members for you to buy the book. And it's recommended reading as far as I'm concerned. So thank you so much for your time today, David, and for writing this incredible book.
Thank you to you and to everybody who tuned in to the Zoom. I could add that as an Australia Day gesture, you can go to Woolworths and purchase the book.
How fantastic.
Just an idea, just a way to celebrate Australia Day.
Well, what would be more honouring of Australia's history than finding out about the very earliest days of our history for Australia Day? Couldn't think of anything more patriotic. Thank you so much, everyone. You can find a video recording of this up on our website later today. And just a reminder, don't forget to tune in to our podcast, Follow the Money and Dollars and Cents, particularly if you want to hear the latest about the Stage 3 tax cuts and the Iowa caucuses earlier this week. That's our latest Follow the Money episode. Thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned, next month we'll be talking to Chanel Contos about her book Consent Laid Bare. head on over to our website to find out details about that. Thank you so much for joining us for our January episode of Australia's Biggest Book Club, and thank you to our guest author, David Marr. Thanks very much, everyone.